Oh, it's not telling me that. Hi, welcome everyone to the online Peace Science Colloquium. It's November 13th, 2017, and we're back again. I'd like to introduce Ariel Petrovics, who will be giving us a talk today. She is a graduate student at the University of California, Davis. And we're joined by excellent discussants yet again. We have Cliff Morgan from Rice University, Julianne Phillips, who's a graduate student at the University of Texas, and William Spaniel, who's an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And we'll start with a presentation from Ariel, and then we'll open it up for our comments and questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ariel.
Okay. Well, thank you guys, all of you, for coming on today. I really appreciate everybody taking the time to take a look at my theory chapter of my dissertation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start the presentation. Okay. Not slide showing it. Here, give me just a second. Can everybody still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. For some reason, it seems to be freezing. Give me just 1 second. All right, I'm going to close it and just open it one more time. Can you guys see my screen okay, though?
Yes, no problem.
Okay. Yeah, this was
just
happening.
Not going into full.
Yeah, it's just it's not opening up and turning on a. Oh yeah, not responding. So that would explain it. Okay, sorry, one more time. Okay.
Good.
There we go.
That's great.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. All right, so I'm presenting the theory chapter of my dissertation today, which is a little new for me. Typically, I present a lot more of the actual quantitative results, but this was a wonderful opportunity to get some great feedback from a number of people who all know a lot about this subject. So I'm going to present the theory chapter, but I'm also happy to talk about some preliminary results or the research design if anybody's interested in talking about that at the end. And my thesis is looking at the effectiveness of different foreign policy strategies at combating nuclear proliferation in weapon-seeking states. And so, not that surprisingly, this is motivated by both recent and ongoing proliferation concerns. And North Korea, obviously, is one of those prime examples. We know that the regime is still seeking a miniaturized weapon, which they can then marry to a delivery system. So this is a relatively timely question. And the question that I ask is, what foreign policy tools most effectively induce deproliferation in proliferating states? And we can think of different foreign policy strategies generally in two large categories. We tend to think of them as positive inducements or carrots versus negative coercion or sticks. And I suggest that the positive inducements will be more effective than coercive strategies at leading to deproliferation in nuclear weapon-seeking states. So just a quick roadmap of the presentation. I'm going to start with the existing literature. This project is built on basically the intersection of two large literatures. One of them is on foreign policy and their different successes or failures. And then there's also a very large body of literature on nuclear proliferation. And I kind of look at the intersection between these two. I then present a testable definition of effectiveness. So how do we know what effective policy looks like when we see it? And I'll then go ahead and map the interaction briefly so that we can all see what a stylized version of sort of a two-player interaction, ascending and a target state, looks like, and use that to help build my theory and then the testable hypotheses that I'll derive at the end. So to begin, the existing literature on nuclear proliferation tends to agree that security threats tend to incentivize proliferation. So of those states that do seek a nuclear weapon, many of them seem to be incentivized to do so by some ongoing or persistent threat or an ongoing rivalry. But once these proliferation concerns have started, we know that there are different foreign policy options that concerned states could use in order to try and combat this. And the foreign policy literature, a relatively small branch of that literature, has actually looked at how different foreign policies might be substitutable goods. They're imperfectly substitutable, but different policymakers or states might choose different kinds of foreign policies when they face some threat. And we know, again, in those two broad terms, we have coercion or inducements. And coercion tends to be the preferred method for many states. So we know that these can include things like economic sanctions or threats or use of force, but they can be costly for the sending state, and they certainly are not guaranteed to be successful. And given this, there is the other option of a positive inducement. However, these tend to be less utilized by policymakers, especially when facing a threat like nuclear proliferation, and they are also therefore given a little bit less attention in the literature. So I try and treat both of these types of foreign policies. And I do so in asking the question, what foreign policy strategies out of the menu of options that policymakers tend to choose will be most effective at inducing deproliferation? And to answer this question, again, I'm going to have to present first, what does effectiveness look like? So I'm going to define it in a way that we can then go ahead and test it in observational data. And I apply this to the specific case of nuclear reversal strategies, but I hope that I might be able to draw some implications from this for future research in other security issues. And so I hypothesize that inducements will be more effective than coercive strategies, but that this isn't enough by itself, that this outcome is going to be mitigated by and moderated by the target-sender relationship and the strength of the sender themselves. It's not just what type of foreign policy the target state is going to receive, the target being the proliferator. It's also who the sender is, who are they facing off against in this interaction. And so this interaction, we can think of in kind of a stylized term. We have two states, a sender S here, can choose between two different types of policies, the negative coercion or the positive inducements. And then the target T will respond to these treatments. And most often we know that senders do tend to prefer things like economic sanctions or the threat or use of force, the more coercive strategies. And these are costs that are imposed against the target as long as they resist, as long as they refuse to comply by rolling back their weapons program. And so facing these, the goal here is that the target will choose from one of three choices. Ideally, they will choose to roll back, in this case, their proliferation program. So that means take themselves a little bit farther away from acquiring the bomb. It doesn't necessarily mean closing everything all at once. It can be small steps, but we hope to see incremental reversal away from acquiring a nuclear weapon. There could be no change at all. The target could just persist in their nuclear proliferation activities unchanged, as if they hadn't ever been coerced. Or there could even be a perverse reaction where the target increases their proliferation behavior in response to this coercive strategy. So seeing this, the sender might instead choose to use a positive inducement. And positive inducements tend to be promises in exchange for cooperation, in this case, rolling back the weapons program. So an inducement could be something like a nuclear cooperation agreement. It could be a diplomatic outreach or maybe foreign aid. And these are offered in exchange for the target to, again, choose to roll back ideally. But again, they have those same three options, so they may just do nothing. They may persist in their nuclear weapons behavior, or they may worsen their behavior. So this means in response to the inducement, they could perversely actually increase their proliferation behavior. And again, I suggest that coercion actually carries a greater risk of perversely increasing proliferation behavior, whereas positive inducements will more effectively lead to rollback in the proliferating state. And so what does effectiveness look like when we see it? So the most common part of foreign policy success that the literature tends to look at is the likelihood, just irrespective of time and anything else, just is this going to succeed? We want to know if this is going to be likely to succeed, and if so, how likely. And then in addition to the likelihood of success, in this case, because there is the option of not just no success, but in fact a worsening outcome, we want to know what the likelihood of these perverse effects could be as well. But this isn't enough by itself. So sending states prefer to have the compliance happen faster. They would prefer the target to roll back their behavior earlier. And so a more effective policy will more rapidly lead to reversal of the nuclear weapons program. And this is because domestic audiences can be impatient, and even imposing these different foreign policies can be costly for the sender, and these costs can accrue over time. So the faster it happens, the less costly it is for the sender to achieve this desirable outcome. But this, again, is not enough on its own. This last outcome here looks at whether or not the success sticks. So does a proliferator who agrees to roll back their nuclear weapons program in fact choose to re-proliferate again not long after they agree to comply? And this basically means that all the effort that went into deproliferation may as well have been wasted, because it's not hard to restart a program. Much of the knowledge and infrastructure is already there. So a target who chooses to relapse after already complying doesn't start from ground zero. They actually are able to proliferate more rapidly than a totally new target. So these are basically the three different elements of effective policy. And I suggest that there's more than just the payout, basically the explicit costs or benefits associated with proliferating that the sender promises, that will actually lead to the target's response to these policies. So we tend to think of the payout, which would be under inducements, a promise of rewards in exchange for deproliferating. And this is intended to increase the target's utility for deproliferation. They basically offered something in exchange for rolling back their nuclear program. The payout for coercion is that there are costs associated with continuing to proliferate. The sender imposes some kind of punishment for proliferation. And these costs end if the target agrees to end their proliferation behavior. So again, this should increase the utility of the target for deproliferation. However, this target will also respond to the implicit signal that the sender's selection of policy will show them. So it's a signal about their security environment that the target faces. And I suggest that these signals will actually either compete with or help compound the payout that the target faces. So under a positive inducement on the top row here, the signal from the positive inducement sends that the sender themselves is in fact more cooperative, and therefore the security environment that the target faces is less conflictual, more cooperative than they had previously assumed. So this should again increase the target's utility for complying. And when they face coercive strategies, targets will update their beliefs about their security environment to find that the sender is in fact conflictual, and therefore their security environment is more threatening than the target had previously believed, which will therefore increase their utility for a nuclear weapon and decrease their utility for complying. So taken together, there's this explicit payout of either a punishment or reward, but also the implicit signal. And the implicit signal of inducements help compound the payout effect, so that both the payout and the signal of an inducement help increase the likelihood that the target will comply. However, for coercive strategies, the signal competes with the explicit payout, meaning that the signal that the sender sends will actually encourage the target to proliferate, even if the payout itself should decrease the target's proliferation. So this will make the coercive strategies less effective. But it's not enough that it's just the choice of tactic. There's also this existing relationship or the strength of the sender themselves. So the identity of the sender is also important in the target's decision to comply or deproliferate. So the existing relationship between senders and targets will help moderate the target's expectations about their security environment. So states don't protect against their allies; they protect against enemies. And so proliferating states, if they receive a cooperative inducement from a known ally, this shouldn't change their opinion of their security environment very much. They won't update their beliefs to find that their security environment is very different than they had previously assumed. It's going to reinforce their old beliefs about their old opinions. However, if they receive a cooperative inducement from a rival, this is unexpected information. And so the target should update their beliefs to find that their security environment is in fact less threatening. And this should be a larger update, a larger change than if they receive the same cooperative signal from an ally. So this means that a cooperative signal from a rival will actually be more effective. It should change the target's perceived need for a nuclear weapon more than if that same cooperative signal comes from an ally. And if the sender, in fact, sends is a nuclear weapons power themselves, and they send a cooperative signal, this should carry more weight than if that same cooperative signal comes from a non-nuclear state. So the potency of the signal itself is dictated in part by the power of the sender.
2 minutes, Ariel.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
A nuclear-armed sender should be more capable of both credibly threatening and more credibly providing the target with either a coercive or inducement strategy. And so taken together, this means that the signal strength is moderated so that a rival nuclear weapon state should be more effective at inducing rollback than the same cooperative signal from an allied non-nuclear weapon state. So in other words, the sender matters as well as the type of policy that they choose. So just to summarize again, I suggest that positive inducements will be more effective than coercive strategies at creating nuclear reversal in proliferating states. So this is in states that are already seeking a nuclear weapon. And I look at both the likelihood of success and failure, as well as the rate, the time that it takes to success, and the sustainability of that success over time. But I also look at the response of the targets to different senders, and I suggest that rivals will be able to more effectively signal cooperation than allies will, and that nuclear weapon-armed senders will be able to more effectively lead to deproliferation than non-nuclear weapon senders. Very quickly, I have already begun and intend to continue doing this analysis in several different ways. So I engage in quantitative analysis, looking at those 3 different measures of effectiveness. And these are all of the different states that have had a nuclear weapons program at one point or another, most of which have actually relinquished them at some point. I then move to using this, I have basically variation in states over time, and variation in their responses to different treatments over time. So variation within and across the target states. And I will also use some case study analysis to process trace in 2 very recent proliferation cases, Iran and North Korea, both of which have had their nuclear weapons programs for many years. They've received different types of inducements and have varied their program and responses over time. So I can look at variation within these states to try and maybe tease out some of the causal mechanisms behind their changes. And that's everything. I really appreciate any comments and feedback that you guys have. And as I said, this is just the theory that I'm presenting here, but I'm also happy to present some of the preliminary results if anybody's interested in seeing those. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen now.
Okay, thank you, Ariel.
Thank you.
And with that, we'll open it up for questions, comments, whoever wants to get started. Someone's got to do it. Someone's got to jump.
I know there have to be comments.
Cliff, you look like you're leaning in.
Okay.
Thanks.
Do you want me to just throw out a couple of questions, or do you want me to sort of develop a big long list of comments? Maybe save that until we're off air.
Save that until you're off air. And so I would do like 1 big comment at a time, and then we can have Ariel respond.
Okay. So what I'll start with is one of the things that I like about the idea of this project is that you're actually starting to think about how to evaluate the success of foreign policy actions, and not just one at a time. You're actually trying to think about, you know, how you compare that. And I'm going to throw out 1 comment and then sort of the question to try and get you to think about some stuff. The comment is that I would actually like to see you be much more specific on what those foreign policy actions are. So rather than just sort of a very generic positive versus negative inducements, I would like you to be able to push this harder and look at very specific sorts of, are we talking about foreign aid? Are we talking about sanctions? Are we talking about military strikes? Are we, because there could be as much variation within those categories as there could be across categories. So now here's the question. When you talk about the success of a foreign policy action, what do you expect? Is this total success? Is this, it's part of bargaining, so you're just hoping to get a better deal than you would have gotten without the inducement? And when you're sort of thinking about, do you stick with non-proliferation or do you go back to it? But basically you're talking about, do we stop? Do we press ahead, or do we roll back? But there could be a lot more gradations than that. So what is it that you expect? And along with that, how frequent of success do you expect? In the paper, you sort of talked about in some of the economic sanctions literature that people note that sanctions work less than half the time. So we take that as an indication that they don't work. But when you're trying to get somebody to do something they don't want to do, I kind of think half the time ought to be the top you should possibly expect, not the floor for considering something successful. So if you could kind of elaborate on that a little bit, that might help me some.
Ariel.
Okay, yeah, thank you for those comments. So I agree that there is definitely some variation within the different types of foreign policy treatment. So I'll go ahead and treat that the first comment first. And when I do the analysis, I look at the different types independently. So I don't actually conglomerate them into positive inducements and negative coercion, though we can kind of typify them and therefore assess them that way. If I were to rank them, and maybe this is something that I should consider putting into the theory itself, make it a little bit more explicit, but I would expect that the things that have a greater signal of threat, a true fundamental security threat, would therefore have the greatest risk of these negative ramifications, sort of in line with that theory of signaling. And so I would suggest that military, especially threats or use of force, would be the least effective unless they actually entirely eliminate the program. So for example, we can think of Israel eliminating the Osirak reactor and basically taking out the weapons program, but that doesn't actually recognize the target's incentive to develop the weapons program. It basically just takes away their ability to do so. But I would argue that it might actually, in fact, increase their incentives. And so, for example, threats of force, especially if they're relatively credible but haven't gone through, might actually induce the target to more quickly try and proliferate to get that nuclear deterrent before the sender can go ahead and make good on their threats. I think that we can kind of see this happening, at least anecdotally, in two of the cases that I'm looking at, both Iran and North Korea, which when they were receiving many threats from, for example, nuclear weapon states, they tended to increase their proliferation behavior. They even increased their own verbal responses about basically their right to a nuclear weapons program and the threat that they faced. So that kind of moves me, and I'll come back to the different types in a moment, but that also moves me to the question that you're asking about, basically what does it look like to see increased or decreased proliferation? And what motivated this question was that we tend to think about just sort of the end result, whether the target has agreed to entirely eliminate their weapons program. They go down to zero, essentially. They agree to sign the NPT, and they open themselves up to inspections, and they get rid of anything that could be a dual use technology. Or they acquire nuclear weapons. So that it's basically this dichotomous. They either don't get a nuclear weapon and have agreed to get rid of it, or they do acquire it and therefore they're done. And my motivation here was that it seems like nuclear weapons programs take a very long time. They take years to increase at the stockpile so that the target can actually create a nuclear weapon. And they take years to develop the technology. So acquiring the nuclear physicists and all of the materials that it would require to create those stockpiles. So it seems like there's basically many points at which different sending states can intercede. And we can think of, for example, in North Korea, during the agreed framework, they open themselves up to inspections, they agree to start closing certain facilities, and that sets them back away from acquiring a nuclear weapon almost immediately. We can also think of the same thing more recently in Iran with the Joint Plan of Action, and they, again, open themselves up. Iran has opened themselves up to inspections. We think they've probably set themselves a little bit farther away from acquiring the bomb. So if I were to think of this as a testable definition, in ideal terms, I would love to have basically like the total stockpiled uranium or plutonium, basically the fissile material for a bomb. We can't know that information, so I try to proxy for it. But what I'm really interested in is basically how long until the bomb, how actively are they working to create that bomb? And if they agree to deproliferate, have they agreed to dismantle some of their centrifuges? Have they agreed to give up some of their, or de-enrich some of their highly enriched uranium or plutonium, so that, again, it takes them farther away from the bomb to break out capacity? And so, again, I think that there's like several different types of foreign policies, and I can talk about some of the preliminary results that I found, but I would think that threats or use of force would be the worst if I had to rank them, and that the most effective would be very credible commitments of cooperation. So I would think about something like a nuclear cooperation agreement that's overseen by some third party, something that both the players can agree would be a reliable third party. And so nuclear cooperation agreements tend to be overseen by the IAEA, and they basically do a lot of the inspections through that. And there's this agreement that the two states will kind of cooperate over time. So in sort of general terms, but there are obviously many more types of foreign policies than that, and I can go into more detail on those if you want to talk about.
So if you want to follow up.
Sure. So the part of the question that you sort of missed was the what do you expect? What do you to consider something to be successful, does it have to actually move? However it is you're empirically defining it. So if it's, if you could identify how much fissile material they have, do you expect it to, do you expect that there is a 100% chance that they reduce some of that? Or when you look at success, are you happy if there's only a 50% chance of that? Is it that we're looking at kind of a probability? And where I actually kind of would push a little bit harder on this is that often when we think about foreign policy success, when we assume that there's a success, if we ask the question of what happens next, there's no answer. So, if you're talking about deterrence, if we deter the other side from acting, what do they do? And the answer is always within the theory, nothing. And, so we've talked Iran into not pushing forward on the development of nuclear weapons. If they replace that with developing submarine technology so they're better able to disrupt shipping in the Persian Gulf, or they replace that with trying to sneak biological weapons into Israel to poison the water, are we actually that much happier than we are with them developing nuclear weapons? So it's more of what do you expect to have happening at the end.
So just to clarify, basically, what do I think that the outcome should be like? And this could be sort of across domains. Doesn't necessarily have to be nuclear. Okay. So I guess a successful outcome would just mean moving farther away from getting the bomb. It doesn't necessarily mean fully dismantling. And that's sort of irrespective of cross-domain responses. I haven't necessarily considered sort of looking at all the different, proliferation or behavioral responses that a target could have in their weapons program, because obviously you could have nuclear weapons, but you could have plenty of different kinds of conventional weapons, and it is possible that the funds just sort of get moved to a different type of program. So
let me rephrase the question a little bit and see if Cliff, please correct me if this is going off on a tangent rather than supporting your question. What is the level of analysis that you're trying to explain behavior on, right? So is it dyadic? Is it cross-national per year? What are you trying to look at when you're saying that there is or there's not success? And how is it that are you measuring it in increments? Are you conceptualizing it, not measuring it? Are you conceptualizing it as increments or a total worldwide phenomenon or what?
Emily, that was almost exactly what I was getting at, as long as we emphasize the conceptualizing and not the empirical part, because that's I'm more thinking about the theory than the testing.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah, I think I understand the question then. So I'm conceptualizing this as I guess dyadic, almost monadic, because there could be multiple different senders, but what I'm really interested in is the target's response. So just a single target, one state and their proliferation response to what I would term as like a foreign policy treatment. So if we imagine that it's almost like experimental and the target is just the single subject and they receive these different treatments, what's their response? And the response that I'm interested in is basically in incremental steps. So do they, after receiving a treatment, do they then change their behavior in, let's say, I mean, ideally we'd be able to know instantaneously whether they had made that decision, but let's say in the next year, what was their then proliferation behavior in response? So what was their target's response to a certain treatment? So if you think about it dyadically, a sender chooses a certain treatment, the target chooses a certain response in their next move. So we'd think of it as the sender moving first and the target moving second with their choice of response. And this could happen many times over time until eventually the target has, if it's a cooperative inducement and it's successful, then that would mean many times over time the target has rolled back their proliferation activity in each new increment of the game. They've gotten farther and farther away from building a bomb. Does that answer?
So are you suggesting that in a given year, a target could receive a military threat from one sender who is an enemy and an economic sanction from an ally and something else from a nuclear capacity state and something else from a non-nuclear capacity? So like they could be getting all kinds of different signals with different characteristics on your typology at once?
That is possible. I haven't seen as much of that actually happening, but it is definitely possible. And so I do try and account for that as well. And what I would theorize is that if you have enough of these different things going on, they may in fact cancel out, but that again, there would be this like strength of the sender. So if a sender has chosen to offer a nuclear cooperation agreement, and they are a nuclear armed rival sender, and they offer some credible commitment of cooperation here. So again, maybe there's some kind of oversight on this, like there's a hand tying strategy, then that may actually even trump the maybe let's say an economic sanction from an ally. But that you could in fact see a lot of this sort of competing effects, but often what we have seen in fact happen is, especially if you're talking about the more powerful nuclear armed states, they do seem to cooperate on a single target, on a single proliferator with one type of strategy. So we could think of, for example, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was many different states all cooperating together on first sanctions and then getting Iran to negotiate. So they were all kind of involved in the same type of strategy. Does that answer the question?
Mm-hmm. Okay, more questions? William.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Good, great. Thank you for presenting. At the risk of living up to a bit of a stereotype, I want to talk about modeling. So, at some point, obviously, you're going to be putting these sorts of papers under review, or chapters of your dissertation that are going to be chopped up into individual papers to put under review. And it's very likely that someone like myself, there's a lot of people in the nuclear literature who are adopting formal models, as well as empirics in their papers. So it's very likely that you would get one of us as a reviewer. And it's clear that from both the presentation and from the paper that you're drawing a lot from the strategic interactions literature in international relations, whether that's the bargaining literature that for a long time was more confined to bargaining in war, but is now more recently being moved into bargaining over nuclear weapons, and also the signaling literature. And so what I want to say is that at some point, I think you're going to need to model at least some of what you're going through, some of your theory. And I say that because the discussion has a lot to do with learning and updating. And so it's not crystal clear in my mind what the source of uncertainty is. And so there has to be some sort of a source of uncertainty if there's going to be learning and updating, because you need to have uncertainty to learn and update. So I need to know what that source of uncertainty is. And I also would have some concerns that whatever learning and updating is going on has to be the function of strategies that various types are choosing to implement, because I'm updating my belief based off of the fact that I'm seeing one thing from one type that I would be seeing less often from another type. So that's my main concern. Now, to speak to some positive aspects of this project, the literature on negotiating over nuclear weapons, at least when it comes to the formal part, and I think also there's not a very good distinction of this in the informal literature either. So I think that this is new ground, whether we're talking about formal or informal, which is that there tends to be this assumption, so to speak, that we make a deal or we don't make a deal, and if we make a deal, then the nukes aren't produced, and if we don't make a deal, they are produced. And there's no ongoing process of learning and updating like what you're talking about, where if I make an offer, you can reject that offer and then develop some additional technology. And then in the next stage, we have another opportunity to negotiate. And in the meantime, because you rejected my previous offer, I've learned something in the meantime that perhaps that offer was insufficient to buy off your particular type, whatever that type may be in the source of uncertainty. And so I'm learning more, and that's going to update my belief, and it's going to change what I do in my next round of negotiation. Yeah, so you already have this process of learning and negotiating over time already built into the project. I want to also note that it's worth emphasizing that there have to be a group of states that are never going down this path at all. And for those states, if we're worried, this is getting to the selection problem essentially. We never see sanctions against countries that are very vulnerable to sanctions because they're so concerned about getting sanctioned that they never engage in the behavior that is going to warrant the sanction. And so this has a connection to the discussion of using carrots versus sticks, where carrots are costly for the sender, the US type actor in like a US versus Iran negotiation. And so if I can get away with using the threat to use force, be it military force in the form of a preventive war or economic sanctions, then I'm going to prefer to go down that route as compared to offering the costly carrots for me. So it's very possible to see that this is more getting into now what we would see with empirics. It's very reasonable to see that inducements do in fact work better, but that does not imply that it is a better strategy for the sender states to be using the carrots because the carrots are costly.
Just to clarify, no, I really appreciate these comments. So to clarify on that last point, what you mean is even if inducements do in fact lead to deproliferation more often, they may in fact be more politically costly for the sending state. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that you may in fact be right. There is a a small body of literature, some of the literature that does look at positive inducements has tended to suggest that there's just this sort of knee-jerk response that you're going to send costs to somebody who's misbehaving and only reward those who behave well. So it's basically like a moral argument that you would, it's not desirable to give a reward for bad behavior. There's also this sort of, and I'll go back to your other questions in a moment here, but this one's kind of, I find this one kind of interesting. Basically that you could also potentially lead to perverse outcomes just by offering the inducements, not necessarily to where this leads to increased proliferation immediately, but maybe you're incentivizing further proliferation down the road, even by other states. So that rewarding this bad behavior essentially encourages bad behavior. And I think that this has some merit, and so therefore this argument that I make about positive inducements may not be very universally applicable, especially beyond nuclear proliferation literature. I think in the case of nuclear proliferation, there's a couple strong disincentives for proliferation that would take away so many benefits that that it might actually be less effective for a state to consider proliferating just in order to maybe receive these benefits. So we think of nuclear proliferation as a pretty costly endeavor. It takes not just material investment, but also there's the human capital aspect, and you have to get all of the uranium and plutonium, which maybe you're buying or maybe you're mining it. So it's a costly endeavor on its own, and it's costly to proliferate to the level that is necessary for a nuclear weapon versus just civilian purposes. So it's costly all by itself. So in order for it to be worthwhile for a potential proliferator to engage in a new weapons program just to seek out these rewards, the rewards would have to be so high that they would not only make up for this cost, but even eclipse them, so that the potential proliferator would come out on top, having proliferated just to receive these rewards and by agreeing to then later deproliferate. So I think that that's unlikely, especially because, kind of going back to Cliff's question about which types of positive inducements I think are going to be the most effective, I theorize, and I'm starting to find that it might be something like a nuclear cooperation agreement. Basically, the target really wants something like nuclear energy, and that often tends to be the excuse that they're using early on, is that they're looking for these civilian purposes. And that's receivable without ever starting a proliferation behavior in the first place. So a nuclear cooperation agreement in exchange for deproliferating, those who are actually seeking a weapon, basically gives them aid for developing a civilian technology. It gives them maybe some of the fuel. It actually helps reprocess the spent fuel. It might share some information in exchange for basically having IAEA inspectors and things like that coming in. But a signatory to the NPT can get all of those goods without ever starting a proliferation behavior in the first place. So I think that it's not as likely for some of these more effective policies, which I think especially when now getting into this, I can see what Cliff was saying about maybe talking about the different types of policies a little bit more. I think that it's not actually that likely to lead to sort of the perverse outcomes. So that's just your last question. So getting back sort of to the first part, and cut me off at any point if anybody wants to jump in and maybe change this question up a little bit.
No, but I would encourage you to have shorter answers so that we can make sure everybody has a chance to give you lots of comments.
Sure, okay. So then quickly in response to the having a formal model, I'm potentially interested in it, and I did actually play around with creating a formal model. And what I was finding is that it's basically the same model that has been created a number of times with different tweaks for things like signaling. It's essentially, the kid signaling game, which is built off of Fearon's games. And I didn't find that it's sort of a tweak on the old models. It's not identical, but it isn't entirely new. And so just in terms of, my use of time, I decided to focus a little bit more on the quantitative analysis, because that seemed to be largely lacking in the literature on nuclear proliferation, largely because there wasn't the data available to do it. So I've been focusing on the quantitative aspects, not because I don't think that a model is useful, but I think that it isn't quite as new necessarily as the quantitative stuff.
Yeah, William.
Yeah, so I don't think that you should be overly concerned that what you're seeing isn't anything new, because none of the models that we've been using are new. Econ wrote these models like 30 years ago. It's that part is not important. What is important is showing that you can get from point A to point B. And I'm not saying that in, for example, a paper that you want to submit to a journal, that you need to have 3,000 words to that model. But lay out the assumptions, show that you have a proposition that says this is true, and then you have a solid comparative static that you can then empirically test. And it's fine to put most of that in the appendix, because again, most of these models, they're not very much different than classic signaling models, but it's good to see how you're getting from point A to point B. And so I know what you're thinking about your source of uncertainty, and there's no miscommunication between you and your reader.
Cliff.
I will say also that I really liked your response. I really liked your responses. I like saying positive things too. I really liked your response to the whole reputation thing, because I totally fall into that camp where I believe exactly what you're saying, but you need to be very good about like reaffirming that, because you will get those comments all the time when talking about nuclear bargaining. So practice that, keep rehearsing it. You're doing a great job, and be prepared to use that again throughout your career.
Cliff has a follow-up.
Okay, partly I just want to second a lot of what William's saying, because I had sort of the same reactions. And I just want to put this in a slightly different way. You are invoking game theory and strategic interaction enough to get into trouble, but you're not following through with it to get yourself out of trouble. And I think that's kind of what he's trying to get at. If it's not, he can correct me.
That's correct. Agreed. Julie.
So this might be a good time for me to jump in, because a lot of my comments are also on this same vein of I was looking for a model, and have a couple of things that might actually help might help if you do decide to go down this route. I do want to start by saying I also think this is a really interesting project, and I'm also really glad to see somebody working on the foreign policy aspects of this whole nuclear question specifically, particularly right now, unfortunately. When I was reading through the theory, it looked like you were using the word type and the word signal, and it seemed to me that in this story that you're telling, these are actually sort of two different things. And I think that my focus here is going to be on the identity of the sender. Who is the one who's actually sending the signal to the target? And specifically, is this not just a conflictual or a cooperative relationship, but is this a friend or a foe to start with? And then what does sending a cooperative signal versus sending a conflictual signal look like for each of these two, and how is it different? What's separating these types, and what do these different kind of types of, I don't want to say opponents, but types of other player want in this case? And the way it's coming off now, it actually feels one-sided in that it's about reducing the current level of threat in the environment, which makes a lot of sense. I'm totally on board with this. But I think that your argument that we should expect greater effects from rivals is coming from this assumption that you can only reduce the threat vis-a-vis your own capability. But one of the things that I think we see a lot in nuclear relationships is that another opportunity here is for states to pull others into their nuclear umbrella. And so an ally, a powerful ally, might be able to reduce the level of threat, not vis-a-vis themselves, not by becoming less threatening, but by sort of offering a commitment to sort of make the rest of the environment less threatening. So I think that you might actually have a broader story here than, but I think that there might also be some implications in that for this sort of rivals being able to have more of an effect than allies.
Thank you for those comments. So I would definitely love to hear a little bit more about the modeling suggestions that you said that you had. I would definitely appreciate those. So let me just make sure that I understand the question properly. So you're saying that it seems like I'm both talking about the type of actor and the signal itself, and that maybe that I'm not giving equal opportunity to both of those different aspects of the theory, or like where is it that I should probably clarify that a little bit more?
She's saying that a sender and target, like the idea of threat isn't what the sender sends, right? The idea of threat is an interaction, right? And so whether the target is threatened or not isn't just a function of what threats are imposed, but how they respond to it and interact with the original sender. Julie, is that correct?
Yeah, that's yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm getting at, and I think that this. Yeah, I'm just going to stop there. Yes, that's
okay. Yeah, so that, I mean, you're right that is basically a large part of what the sort of the second half of my theory is built around, is that there's both a signal that's being sent, but that it's interacting with a pre-existing environment. So one of the reasons why I theorize that a nuclear armed sender can be more capable of inducing deproliferation than a non-nuclear armed one is in part this offer of the umbrella. So both a nuclear armed sender can more credibly threaten, which means that they could actually have even worse perverse consequences, but they can also offer these things like a nuclear cooperation agreement can really only be offered by a nuclear armed sender. It obviously a non-nuclear state can't offer to have like a nuclear cooperation agreement. But then even more so, there's this alliance, there's the umbrella aspect of it. And one of the reasons why I don't focus on that quite as much is because some of the recent literature that I've been reading finds that is not always actually that effective, that the alliances just are not always found to be that credible. And so it can be effective, but it doesn't necessarily have to come from an ally, and often didn't necessarily come from a traditional ally. Like the alliance was then built up around this umbrella, meaning that the pre-existing alliance isn't a necessary element of the umbrella being successful. So it doesn't have to be coming from an ally to have the nuclear umbrella be successful. It just has to be coming from a nuclear armed sender. And also that if the target finds themselves to be in a really insecure environment, that sometimes is not enough. They may want just their own indigenous weapon. And we see that in sort of the kind of the questions about whether or not South Korea and Japan might choose to nuclearize today, despite the fact that they're actually covered by a nuclear umbrella, just because they might feel like, well, how credible do we think it is that the US might actually come to back us if North Korea were to be using conventional weapons against us? Would the US really come to our aid with some kind of nuclear umbrella, or do we just want that deterrence ourselves so that North Korea would never attack us? So that's sort of where my thinking is. I agree that the nuclear umbrella is definitely a large part of why sort of cooperation might be helpful, but it may not be enough by itself. And I think a lot of it is sort of this ability to sort of offer other things and the real focus on that security environment in general. If you have any other comments about the model as well, I would love to hear those too if there's time, or afterwards. I'd be happy to talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, happy to send comments offline as well. But this last point that you bring up about credibility is one of the places that I actually think a model is really going to help, because the question that I had reading this is what makes these signals credible, not just in terms of a nuclear umbrella, but really for any of the senders. And this comes back to the question of just what are the sender's incentives, and what does the sender want, and how do they make those signals costly enough to actually be credible?
I think that for the senders to make a credible commitment, and I had originally included a very long discussion about like different credibility mechanisms and sort of ex ante versus ex post credibility. And because it was mostly a rehashing of the literature, I ended up trying to cut it out for sake of pages. It's already getting a little bit long. But I think I mean, obviously it has to be credible, especially because what I'm talking about here is having it come from a rival. So it wouldn't just be credible all by itself. The target has a reason to not believe the sender. If I'm saying that it really needs to come from a rival. But I think that especially these hand tying strategies, especially again, because it's coming from a rival. So having it just be costly ex ante may not be sufficient on its own. So something like imposing economic sanctions. We know that those are a sort of an ex ante cost to demonstrate this credible commitment to the target complying. And that's one of the big reasons why we think that sort of sanctions, that they're not just a pain that's inflicted on the receiving state or the target. They're also sort of a way for the sender to signal that they really care about this issue. And they could be signaling to their domestic audiences, they could be signaling to the international environment. But sometimes this may not be enough by itself. It's very possible that the sender's incentives could change down the road. So especially in an environment like the US negotiating with North Korea or Iran, where this has happened before, they negotiate, they think they've come to some kind of a good conclusion, like with the agreed framework, or back in 2003 in Iran. We know that there were, positive sort of like negotiations that seemed to be heading the right direction, and then the U.S. said this wasn't enough. Never mind, we actually want to change it, or a new leader gets elected, and they say, well, we didn't negotiate this. This isn't enough. And so I actually think that if I were to have to choose, I actually think hand tying strategies would be more effective in this case than the ex ante costs. You're right, that it has to be credible. And again, I didn't get into the long discussion of which types because of sort of length of time, and I was starting to head down a rabbit hole. But I think that if I had to choose, and again, I'm kind of trying to see what comes out in the data, but I think that some kind of hand tying strategy where there's some kind of enforcement mechanism or oversight, so that even if there is leadership turnover, even if there is changing incentives within the sending state, the target might still be able to believe that they will continue down the road.
If I could just insert my prerogative here, it's from the series of comments about whether you should or should not have a model. I think that if I had to guess, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but our discussants are pushing you to think about a model, not because it needs to be formalized, but because you are making a lot of assumptions that are not explicitly in your paper in a clear way. And so in your answering of all of these questions, you're giving us a lot of information about how you see the world and how you're interpreting different kinds of empirical actions that are not in the paper, right? In terms of what are the reservation values of the actors, and what are the kinds of trade-offs that they're making in making their decisions, and how are they interacting with one another in anticipation of each other's actions. What is it that they can do? Like, are they appealing to other audiences instead of, and not just each other? So there are lots of things that you're saying in your responses that are not clearly laid out in a logical fashion in your paper, that I think either would be fixed with a model, right? In that it's a closed form theory, or just a super clear logical explanation of all of these assumptions. But because we're talking about a signaling model and different kinds of senders and different kinds of ways they can send signals, right? If your answer to Cliff is accurate in that anything that is coercive or inducing could be in your model, then there are different assumptions about how all of those different things work that you need to account for. So you, in being clear about how narrow or how wide your theory is, would help like narrow what assumptions you need to make and how those assumptions translate into logical outcomes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess I would have a quick question then. So it sounds like basically a model would be desirable, at least in an appendix form, if nothing else, in terms of clarifying my thinking on how all of this plays out. Would it also be sufficient, if that's included in an appendix, would it be sufficient sort of to expand on this sort of informal model that I lay out in the paper, and to just go through all of the other assumptions there? And if so, would that be enough on its own, or should there really be that formal model, at least in an appendix?
If I can jump in here, we might be being a little unfair to you in this particular forum, because if you look at the other people whose pictures are on here, we all do formal models, right? So the bias is going to be toward pushing you to, yes, you should formalize this theory. Once we're sort of off air, I'll give you a much nastier and longer explanation of where I think the problem is that you're facing. But, I think your takeaway should be really, what do you want to do? If you really are, if you really want to develop the theory along the lines you're trying to develop it, I think you need to formalize it. I think you need to be, and everything Emily just said is spot on. A lot of it is just, you need to lay things out a lot more clearly and justify them a lot more clearly. That may not be what you want to do. You may want the emphasis to not be so much on the precise underlying logic of the theory. You may want to put the emphasis much more on the empirics. You may want to put the emphasis much more on sort of policy recommendations. So I think your takeaway should be, again, I'll go back to you're sort of invoking formal models enough to get in trouble with formal modelers, but you're not doing enough to get yourself out of trouble with that. And I think you just need to figure out what you want the focus to be and what you want the contribution to be, and that'll tell you which direction to go.
Very well said, Cliff. William.
Yeah, sorry about that. To follow up on what we were talking about earlier about having already worked out some of these models before, that, yeah, signaling models have been done, and they've been done in IR, and we have at least some sort of tacit, or basically all of us in this discipline now have some sort of tacit familiarity with them. But the usefulness of having a model here is that there are nuances to nuclear proliferation that don't show up in, for example, the bargaining model of war literature. There's this time delay between when you set out to develop a program, as you mentioned, to when you actually get it. The fact that building weapons is sometimes unobservable, which was part of the main contribution of the Debs and Montero IO piece from a few years ago. There's this trade-off between launching preventive war and trying to buy off. And you don't see that sort of trade-off in a bargaining model of war framework. So there's lots of nuance that you can do. And this is why we continue to model, despite the fact that signaling models are actually fairly old, like they go back decades. But how signaling actually interacts in these very specific frameworks varies from framework to framework. And so that's one of the reasons why it's useful to develop that and actually write it down and disseminate it to a broader audience.
Just to, I guess, clarify a little bit, I do see myself as a quantitative person. So I am a quantitative analyst. That's all of the work that I've done previously is quantitative, and the bulk of the dissertation will be quantitative. 3 of the chapters out of the 5 substantive ones are quantitative chapters. However, I think that the quantitative analysis is more interesting if it is involved in some kind of theory about why I expect what I expect. And in this case, because it is a signaling game, and that is basically what I'm building off of, it is sort of that kind of literature. I do, so that sort of answers Cliff's question a little bit about like, where do I want to sort of put all my eggs? And I don't want them all to be in the quantitative basket. I see that as my main contribution, but I think that it can be more useful if it's sort of tied to something that's explicit and, a theory about how I think the world works. And so if it would be much clearer in a game like this, this kind of interaction, to have that kind of formal model, especially if it's something where I'm not developing one from scratch, and so I don't necessarily need to spend the remainder of my PhD career developing it. Then I definitely understand what you're saying about using that to kind of clarify the language. I just don't know that I would have the time to become an adequate formal modelist to be able to do enough justice to kind of developing an entirely new one from scratch that might deal with everything that I'm talking about. So I guess I need to kind of play with whether I can do something that's simple enough that I can kind of develop it without spending the next year doing it.
We're getting close to time, so I'm going to take a last couple of questions, and then Ariel we can talk a little bit more offline. So Julie.
This is actually just to tack on a little bit in this vein. We're just going down to tack on to William's earlier comment about not needing to create something entirely new in modeling that nobody's ever seen before. And if, as you're saying, you've been working on this model and it does look very much like some of these signaling models that we've seen before, I think that in your case, this can actually be a strength, because if you can convince us that these models that we know and that we've accepted can map usefully into this new subject area that we haven't used them before, in the way that, as William was saying, we solve the economists, proliferation can steal them from, war. That may actually help you in convincing your audience that the logic that you're laying out is sound and that we should believe it, because we've believed it before and we've seen this mechanism work before, and it's something that we do put some stock into already. So I think that if you've got something that builds onto what you've seen before, that may actually be a great strength in this case.
Any other substantive questions that we want to bring up?
Thank you for that, Julie. That's helpful.
Okay. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you so much for presenting your paper and sharing it with us. And anybody who's interested in watching online and would like to see more of this, the paper is available on the online Peace Science Colloquium website. And I would also like to thank Cliff and Julie and William for reading the paper and taking the time to think about it. And I hope that our viewers will join us again in 2.5 weeks. So after Thanksgiving, we have our final meeting of the semester on December 1st, which is a Friday, and Zachary Steiner-Darkold will be presenting a paper for us. And with that, thank you very much.